The topic that I've been assigned to speak on is revisionism and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The topic itself gives the answer. I don't really have to say to you how the Soviet Union collapsed. It collapsed because of revisionism in the field of ideology, in the field of politics, in the field of political economy, and every other field. It's a very important topic. It's since 1991, 23 years ago, the Soviet Union collapsed. As far as I'm concerned, it's the saddest day in my life when that happened. And when I wrote on the reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I've never experienced as much pain in anything than in writing the reasons for the demise of the Soviet Union. I have written one fairly large pamphlet. It's called Perestroika, The Complete Collapse of Revisionism. And then I supplemented it recently, 3-4 years ago, by a shorter pamphlet called Revisionism and the Demise of the Soviet Union. Because my book dealt basically with the economic causes. And the reason at that time was that I didn't believe that there was anybody who didn't know the political reasons. So there was no point repeating them in the book. But then, as life went on, younger people come into the movement. They haven't lived through the era that some of the ancient ones like me have lived through. So they didn't really know it, and for their benefit, I wrote that pamphlet. So any one of you who's really interested in knowing at least my views on the subject, then these are the two pamphlets that you should somehow acquire. Let me just put it further. I don't make a living out of my writings. I'm lucky if I ever manage to cover the price of printing them. I publish my own books because I'm so popular. Nobody else will publish me. Now, the reasons for discussing this topic is basically very simple. When you go into the working class movement, the bourgeoisie have not only since the collapse of the Soviet Union, but also before the collapse of the Soviet Union, have sought to undermine the confidence of the working class in not only being able to destroy something old, but to build something new. And they introduce into the minds of people a certain level of cynicism. Nothing can change. Human nature is like that. Nothing will work. The Soviet Union has collapsed. It was bound to collapse. And this cry of the bourgeoisie is then supplemented by the Trotskyites and revisionists who say, well, we told you so. This was bound to collapse. So if it had collapsed after 500 years, they would have said, well, we told you so. But the fact of the matter is the Soviet Union did manage to live for over 7 decades, during which time its achievements were world historic. There has not been a better society human beings have organized anywhere than that which was organized in the old Soviet Union. I do not wish in any way to impugn other socialist countries, but nothing in my view is comparable to that great, gigantic experiment, successful experiment in building a new society, building socialism, creating a new socialist human, and actually achieving earth-shaking successes from politics to political economy to ideology, and of course the crowning victory in the Second World War, where Soviet Union made the largest possible contribution to the defeat of this mightiest of all imperialist powers up to then, namely Nazi Germany. The collapse of the Soviet Union begins with the death of Stalin, and soon after that, particularly with the 20th Party Congress of the Soviet Union, which took place in early 1956. At that particular Congress, Khrushchev made what is known as a secret speech. It was secret as far as the Soviet people were concerned. It was secret to the fraternal communist parties, but it wasn't secret to the bourgeoisie. Copies of it had been smuggled to interested quarters in the imperialist camp. And eventually, when the report came out, and for years Soviet Union wouldn't confirm that it had actually been, the speech had been made, it came out through a correspondent in a British newspaper. Khrushchev launched a wild attack on Stalin portrayed him as a cruel human being, somebody who was responsible for the deaths of millions of people, somebody who had stood in the way of building socialism and socialist democracy. There was no abuse that Khrushchev showered on Stalin, which was matched even by the bourgeoisie. The opponents of Soviet socialism, from bourgeoisie to Trotskyites, were very disheartened by the time the Second World War ended. Because at the end of the Second World War, which was supposed to have put an end to the Soviet Union, not only did the Soviet Union survive, although she had suffered tremendous losses, 27 million dead, thousands of villages destroyed, thousands of enterprises destroyed, its economy ruined, etc. All the same, it emerged from that war not a single socialist country, but with a whole socialist camp. There wasn't a capital in Eastern and Central Europe where the red flag with its hammer and sickle did not fly proud. It was also joined by socialist countries in the Far East, in DPRK, Korea, in China, in Vietnam, etc. And by the time that had taken place, one quarter of human beings and 1/3 of the world's territory were under socialist rule. And it shook imperialism to its very foundations. It tried to do its best in order to undermine the socialist countries. They couldn't do it by a frontal attack. They wanted to do that in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, when the Cold War literally started before the Second World War was finished. They couldn't attack the Soviet Union because the prestige of the Soviet Union was so high that even the American public, anti-communist though it was, would not have been able to put up with that attack. America was relying on its hegemony and in its monopoly of nuclear weapons. It had exploded the atom bomb over 2 cities in Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Not to get Japanese surrender, because the Japanese were on their knees by that time, they were ready to surrender. It was done basically for 2 purposes. One was to make sure that Japan would not surrender to the Allied forces, including the Soviet Union, which is what had been agreed, that it will surrender to the combined forces. There were plans for the Soviet Union first to defeat the Japanese in Manchuria and then move on to the main Japanese land, if you like. The Americans dropped it to preempt that, to make sure that the surrender of Japan took place at the hands of the United States alone. The idea was that Japan was a highly developed country compared with other Asian countries, and any foothold that the Soviet Union might have would of course enhance the industrial and technical capabilities of the socialist camp. They'd already seen what was happening in Western Europe. The Red Army liberated from country after country. It was an occupation of part of Germany, and they didn't want this repeated in the case of Japan either. The second reason was it was a warning to the Soviet Union. We have this weapon of exceptionally, horribly, destructive proportions, and if you do not behave, we will do the same to you. So the Soviet Union, of course, knew, and the Soviet Union had come to know at the Potsdam Conference, it knew, of course, through its agents beforehand, where President Truman, who had taken over from Roosevelt, who died a few months earlier, said to Stalin that America had exploded a very powerful weapon. And Stalin said, "Thank you, Mr. President, for informing me," and moved away. And of course, they intensified their efforts to build their own bomb. And by October 1949, the month and the year when China liberated itself, and Chairman Mao stood in Tiananmen Square and declared that Chinese people had stood up, and the Soviet Union exploded its bomb. These were 2 bombs that literally put imperialism in a state of perplexity. They didn't know what to do. So they were very powerful. They couldn't any longer launch a frontal attack on the Soviet Union. They did it through a proxy war against North Korea in 1950, and they were fought to a standstill. They were fought to a standstill because all the socialist countries, North Korea, China, Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union were singing from the same hymn sheet. There were Soviet pilots manning nominally North Korean Air Force. And North Korea didn't have an Air Force at that time. They had not been liberated for more than 5 years. North Korea was a very backward place at that time. They didn't have an Air Force. But it was the Soviet pilots who were flying these planes and wearing, of course, North Korean uniforms. And every now and then, as is normal, if you actually speak two languages, you revert to your own mother tongue. And Soviet pilots would speak in Russian to each other. And this would be picked up on American radio signals. And this was sent to Truman administration, who kept quiet about it, because had it been made open that the Soviet pilots were shooting American warplanes, there would be a clamor for war against the Soviet Union, which would be a very dangerous thing those days. So these were the reasons for the explosion of the bomb. They couldn't defeat capitalism, socialism by a frontal attack. It had to be done invidiously. And what better to do than find traitors within the working class movement? Try and corrupt the ideologies of the countries concerned. American army had very great difficulty catching the Apaches. They could run and walk much faster than an American soldier. So the Americans found a way of doing something to catch an Apache. Get an Apache to catch an Apache. They recruited Apaches who could run fast and could, act for the American army, and they caught them. So the Americans, of course, and the various imperialist powers tried their best to corrupt leadership within the socialist camp. And they were, I am sad to say, successful in that. The whole barrage of imperialist propaganda, which causes the Soviet Union to change course under the leadership of Khrushchevite revisionists. I want to mention a number of specific points. I cannot do justice to any of these points specifically because it takes too long, so I shall mention them as briefly as I possibly can. After the 20th Party Congress, the denunciation of Stalin was only a part and an overt part of changing course. Stalin was connected with the dictatorship of the proletariat. His name was indelibly connected with the achievements of the Soviet Union in the field of collectivization and industrialization and the Second World War. So if you want to malign socialism, you do not attack it directly, because had Khrushchev tried to malign socialism directly, he would have been lynched. He couldn't do that. In fact, he had to do everything under the name of bringing the real Lenin and Leninism to the forefront by actually denouncing this man that he said had distorted Marxism-Leninism and had led Soviet society astray. But having done that, the Khrushchevites changed their policy, the Soviet Union policy, on a whole number of issues. One of the things that they did was put forward the thesis that it was no longer necessary for the proletariat and the oppressed peoples to come to power through armed revolution. They could come to power peacefully. All they had to do was to actually elect members in parliament, and the majority could introduce socialism. It was always done in the name, because the world situation had changed. There was a powerful Soviet country which backed peaceful transitions, and therefore there was no need to fight in a revolutionary way. This went completely against the tenets of Leninism. Every now and then I'll give you a small quotation. I hope you forgive me, because the reason for giving a quotation is A, to give it the authentic Leninist viewpoint, and B, Lenin puts it in words that I cannot even imagine to be doing it. It's done so succinctly and so beautifully. Said Lenin once, "Only scoundrels or simpletons can think that the proletariat must win majority in elections, carried out under the yoke of the bourgeoisie, under the yoke of wage slavery, and that it should win power afterwards. This is the height of folly or hypocrisy. It is substituting voting under the old system and with the old power for class struggle and revolution." And this was nothing short of opportunism in the working class movement. It had been done before, and of course the Kautskyites did that. And in doing so, the working class movement was dissolved. The emphasis was no longer in organizing the revolutionary proletariat for a revolutionary overthrow of the bourgeoisie, but actually winning the battle for parliamentary elections. Now, if you have any experience of parliamentary elections, there's not a hope in hell of the working class winning even parliamentary battles. Even assuming that these members, majority of the members in parliament, would pass legislation to expropriate the bourgeoisie, which would be accepted peacefully by the bourgeoisie. It doesn't happen like that. Wherever the experiment has been tried in the world, it has failed miserably, and it has led to the slaughter of people who practice that principle. We have a perfectly good example in the case of Chile, and there are probably other minor examples, where President Allende was murdered by the Chilean Air Force with the assistance of the CIA, and thousands of other people were done to death. When the Indonesian Communist Party was very powerful and there was a chance that it could win elections, the Indonesian Communist Party was decimated by a military coup led by General Suharto. So it doesn't take place. So the first thing they do is disarm the proletariat and get them down the blind alley of peaceful transition to socialism. Another thesis they put forward was that the Soviet state had ceased to be the dictatorship of the proletariat. It had become a state of the whole people. Now, you don't have to be very clever. You don't have to be an erudite Marxist. You only have to know a bit of Marxism to realize what Marxian position on the state is. What is the state? State is nothing but an instrument in the hands of one class for the suppression of another. State only comes on the scene of world history when society has become divided into two classes, exploiters and exploited. And the exploiters need a state to keep that position going, whereby they can continue to be the dominant exploiting class. The moment state comes to represent the whole of society, the state as such disappears. There's no need for a state. So the whole idea of the state of the whole people is an absurdity. It's basically actually a means of taking away the surveillance and vigilance of the proletariat through its own state over the former exploiters, who can now be regarded as just like everybody else, just like proletarians. There's no need to keep an eye on them. They are perfectly good Soviet citizens, but they were not like good citizens. These people have a very long memory. The working class may have a short memory, but the exploiters and their descendants have a very long memory. They do not forget. They can also, after 100 years, find the old title deeds or copies of them which were buried by the revolutionaries and say, this farm, this land is ours, and we're gonna claim that. Along with that, Khrushchev put forward another thesis, which was that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had ceased to be the party of the Soviet proletariat. It had become a party of the entire Soviet people. Well, political parties, by their very nature, represent classes. A class can have more than one party. A class can have more than one party, but no party can represent all classes. Now, all the imperialist countries have a governing party and an opposition party, which is waiting 5-10 years later it comes to power and the governing party goes into opposition, and this musical chairs is played constantly. But none of these parties represent the working class. They all represent the bourgeoisie. I don't want to annoy you if you're a Labour Party supporter, but it exactly happens in our country, whether it's Labour, Tories or Lib Dems or UKIP, who knows tomorrow, they all represent the bourgeoisie. They do not represent anybody else. They may pretend to represent the working class, but their job is to divide the working class and to keep it divided so that they can continue, these political parties can continue to serve the bourgeoisie. Now UKIP is coming on the scene. It says now, demagogically, Labour no longer represents the working class, we represent the working class. How do they represent the working class? Banish every immigrant. Even people who are born there, and if they are of immigrant origin, their children must be sent back and repatriated. Right? That is the position. That is how they defend the interests of the working class. If there is such a thing as an indigenous population, because you have to have your demarcation boundaries as to when the working class becomes indigenous. Capitalism, by its very nature, has transported people from one end of the world to another. Or it has attracted people from other places which were less developed. So population in the very developed countries actually happens to be of mixed origin. That is actually something in favor of such a system, that actually it brings that kind of vibrancy into society, that it can gather people, as Lenin used to say. New York is a big city which gathers together people of all nationalities and churns them into Americans. And that thing is taking place in every big city in the world and in every large factory or enterprise. That's something progressive. So the fact of the matter is they mean to divide the working class. I have lived in this country for 52 years. That's telling you how old I am. I've lived in this country for 50 years, 2 years. Every time there is a lot of discussion about immigration and too many foreigners here, I know the election must be very near. You know, it's a sign that there's an election, and you constantly stoke up this thing because there is a need for it. The Tories and Lib Dems formed a coalition, and one of their programs was to reduce the number of immigrants coming into this country, net immigration, to tens of thousands. And what is the result after 4 years of their being in coalition? Last year, the number of net immigrants, 260,000, was far higher than at any time before that. Well, that just shows that the intentions of the coalition and the laws passed by British Parliament are not as strong as the laws of the market. People come not because they get a warm welcome. Well, you know they don't. They come not because they like the food here. Some of them do, some of them don't, right? But they come here because it is natural for human beings to go where they can improve the economic conditions of their families. Europeans have gone all over the world. America is based, founded on a successful, gigantic experiment in genocide, right? And Australia. And this has been happening. And then those people who didn't even want to leave Africa forcibly transported as slaves to the New World. So there's a churning of population goes on. That is what has happened. And no point railing against immigrants. The basic thing is, when immigrants have come here, the working class needs to embrace them, actually take them into the struggle against capitalism. If they are in trade unions, they need to be brought closer to other people. Very often, actually, they come from places where there is a lot of militancy. That militancy can be used, just as in Marx and Engels' time, the Irish were far more militant than anybody else. And the last thing Marx and Engels wanted to say was, let the Irish go home. Although they knew that the coming of the Irish reduced the living standards of the English workers because they were cheap labor. But since Marx and Engels' days, something quite different has happened. Capitalism, free competition capitalism, has developed into monopoly capitalism. And one of the characteristics of monopoly capitalism is a huge export of capital. You no longer actually export goods and trade, you also actually set up production facilities abroad, because labor is cheap, land is cheap, the regulation is not that strong, and so you set up there. And what happens? Without watching a single horrible immigrant come in across the borders into your country, the jobs have disappeared anyway. So there's a combination of people losing jobs and pressure being on jobs. And that combination is export of capital combined with the increasing productivity of labor. Now, we've heard lately Britain is losing in the game of productivity, but this is only a temporary blip. Capitalism cannot live on the basis of stagnant productivity of labor. And of course, there's immigration. And it's no point singling out immigration. The most important thing is that working people, a certain proportion of working people, become superfluous to the needs of capital. If the population of this country were to be halved, there would still be unemployment. Because that is the basic workings of capitalism. It cannot be otherwise. So you cannot have a party of the whole people. It's either a party of the working class or it's a party of the bourgeois. Bourgeois parties always claim to be the parties of the entire people. They have to do that. Can you give me a glass of water? They have to do that. What would you think of a party which said, we rule on behalf of British monopoly capitalism. We represent them. Don't you dare to ask anything else. Even the most dim-witted workers will rise up and revolt against such an assertion. So they have to pretend to represent the entire people. We're all in the same boat. Those who are enjoying themselves, who have huge amounts of means of production, who exploit workers, and of course those who lost their jobs. We're all in the same boat, and one day the economy will grow, there'll be a trickle-down effect, and it'll lift all the boats, and we'll be fine. It'll be a tide that does that. Another corruption that the Khrushchevites brought into the political sphere was on the question of peaceful coexistence. Now, peaceful coexistence is a term which is coined by and is a policy which is brought into existence by Lenin himself. Socialism came to just one country. The rest of the world stayed capitalist. So the socialist country in those circumstances had to find a way of existing side by side with other countries that were not socialist. But that is as far as it went. But it didn't mean that the Soviet Union, ruled by the proletariat, would give up the principles of proletarian internationalism, that it would stop supporting revolutionary movements or the national liberation movements in the oppressed countries. It wouldn't. It will continue to do so, and that was a very important part of it. But when the Khrushchevites came to power, their basic proposition was all-round cooperation with imperialism. No revolutions should take place because that would actually start a war. It's well known, for example, that the Soviet Union under Khrushchevites and under their influence, the French Communist Party did not support the struggle of the Algerian people for self-determination and liberation from France. This carried on, and this was done all in the name of, Khrushchev said, because France always said their colonies were not colonies, they were external provinces. Some of them sent even members into French parliament, Fine, but that didn't take away from the fact that they had no right to control their own affairs. They had no right to control their economies. They were exploited to the hilt by French colonialism and imperialism. And the Khrushchevites, in the name of not interfering in the internal affairs of France, did not give any support to the Algerian Revolution. And the French Communist Party did exactly the same. But then, lo and behold, the liberation struggle in Algeria became very important, and it succeeded. And as soon as it succeeded, the Soviet Union rushes in to recognize the revolutionary government. So there was really a number of things which were done where the Iraqi Communist Party was decimated as a result of Khrushchevite policies, which advised the Communist Party in Iraq not to take over power because that would upset imperialism. Now that's a very controversial point. We can discuss it and perhaps during the debate following my presentation. Then the Khrushchevites put forward, combined with that, new theses on war and peace. They said that since the coming into being of nuclear weapons, war had become no longer an option. It was not something that could take place. In other words, nuclear weapons had changed the situation to such an extent that there was no possibility of war because any war could turn into a nuclear war. First of all, there's no logic in saying that any war can turn into a nuclear war. And secondly, it is also certain that war will disappear while imperialism still continues to exist. Now, the biggest source of war is the continued existence of imperialism. Those who want to abolish war, those who want to see permanent peace, it's no point simply marching up and down the street and saying we want peace, right? Or like the Stop the War coalition say, don't attack such and such a country, as though anybody is going to take notice. The biggest demonstration we had in the anti-war movement was before the start of the 2003 Iraq war. I don't know whether it was 1 million people or 2 million, but I settled for the lower figure. There were 1 million people marching against the then impending war. And literally as they were marching, aeroplanes, warplanes were flying from airfields in Britain, going over to Iraq to bomb Iraq. The whole slogan of peace is a meaningless slogan unless it is connected with the struggle for the overthrow of imperialism and substituting a socialist regime in its place. Peace cannot be brought by a combination of liberals, laborites, well-meaning parsons, although I have higher respect for well-meaning parsons than I have for the politician of the Labour or the Liberal parties. And sometimes I think even the conservatives some conservatives tend to be more sincere about it than the wishy-washy laborites. But the fact of the matter is, unless and until imperialism is abolished, there's no way that peace can be established. The Khrushchevites, on the other hand, inculcated the illusion that it was perfectly possible to have imperialism exist and no war being around. That's not possible. And then the last thing that the Khrushchevites did was distorted Marxist theory in the field of political economy. Well, ever since the Soviet Union came into being, it has been the refrain of the bourgeoisie that socialism cannot succeed. Why? Because without the market, a well-functioning economy is impossible. No economic calculation is possible without the market. There were two economists at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution who put forward that view. One was a Russian called Perestroika, who said that, and then there was an Austrian, I believe, called von Mises. Nothing could be done to von Mises. He was in a foreign country, but Perestroika was expelled for saying that. He was expelled from the Soviet Union, that you couldn't really have a socialist economy because there was no market. And what happens with the onset of Khrushchevites is that they accept, and this is the first time a ruling party, Communist Party, has accepted it, they accepted that argument that without a market, there can be no well-functioning economy. It happened through a series of acts. During the time that Stalin was alive, there were a number of Soviet economists. They were in a minority, but they were in existence, who put forward that view, not openly, but indirectly. They tried to do it by putting forward ideas like that the law of value did not exist in the Soviet Union, that the Soviet government had either abolished or transformed the law of value. Now, when you read that discussion, it looks very esoteric. It's like scholastics or the medieval Roman Catholic Church. Why are they talking about the law of value has been abolished? Or it's been transformed. And Stalin says, no, it hasn't been abolished. It hasn't been transformed. The Soviet Union is powerless to do away with this law unless the conditions that underlie the existence of that law are themselves abolished. What is the law of value? It's the law that prevails in a society that produces either all or some of its goods in the form of commodities, which means they are produced not for use by the people who produce, but for sale in the market. And Soviet Union could not at one go abolish the law of value for the simple reason communism had come into a country which was relatively backward. There was a large peasantry, and the peasantry, although it had been organized into collective farms, was in a completely different position to the one occupied by the working class. Industry had been completely nationalized. The state owned the industry. The working class owned the whole of industry. And it owned whatever was produced in industry. But the situation was very different in the collective farms. In the collective farms, the means of production were owned by the state. The means of production being the land and the machinery, the farm machinery and tractor stations were owned by the state. But after that, there were a lot of things which were owned by the collective farms. The seed that they used for sowing their crops was theirs. The farm buildings on each collective farm belonged to the collective farm. And the collective farmers were paid according to the work units, the number of work units they put each year. And the produce, after they had delivered a certain amount of produce, industrial as well as grain, to the state, belonged to them, and they took it to the market. So by the time the second 5-year plan comes to an end, the Soviet Union has become a powerful industrialized country. It's producing sufficient in the way of industrial agricultural products as well as food grain, etc., to be self-sufficient, even to be able to export something to exchange for machinery from countries like Germany and other places. And it was on the basis of that they were able actually to build themselves into a powerful country that was to go on to defeat the Nazis in the Second World War. And so by the time the Khrushchevite reforms had gone through, within 10 years of these reforms being put in place, Soviet economy, although still developing, its rate of development had declined slowly. And by the time that Brezhnev's period ends, it's known as the period of stagnation. The production is not actually into decline in the negative sense. It is still developing, but very little compared with the earlier period. And when Gorbachev comes, they're saying, well, it's really the central planning that has brought us to this place. We need more market and we need more openness. We need more discussion. And their idea of openness was to open the floodgates to all kinds of bourgeois propaganda aimed at undermining and destroying socialism. So eventually comes the time when Gorbachev and company throw in the towel and they say, we want the market. The word socialism completely disappears and the Soviet Union went down. And it went down with the working class not firing a single shot against it. Yeltsinites come and shoot down elected members of parliament, kill them, with the Western imperialist countries saying what an act of democracy it was that Yeltsin had shot down these elected parliamentarians that he could not control. So the Soviet Union was brought down by the enemies within. The working class movement over the last 100 years has suffered defeats, not so much at the hands of its opponents, the bourgeoisie, as at the hands of people within it. That is what happened during and in the aftermath of the First World War, when social democracy betrayed the revolution, joined the bourgeoisie, and actually was mobilized against Soviet socialism as well. And that's what happened as from the time that the Khrushchevites came into power. The pernicious influence of market socialism and the attendant doctrines, corrupting doctrines in the field of ideology and politics and culture brought down the Soviet Union. The Soviet population had been so softened up with this barrage of propaganda by imperialism and the revisionists within the Soviet Union that after 30 years they didn't know what was good and what was bad. In some countries in Eastern Europe, I know a German comrade who was from the former GDR. He said, you know, Harpal, we sold our country, that GDR, for a bunch of bananas. You know, there were certain shortages in socialist countries because of the world trade relations. It was difficult to get bananas in the German Democratic Republic. But German Democratic Republic was a very decent society. It looked after its young, it looked after its old people. It had no unemployment. The food in the German Democratic Republic may not be gourmet cooking, but it was wholesome, decent food that you would love to have had. And that was brought down because imperialism was constantly saying, you know, you don't get bananas. You don't get ladies' underwear in 50 different colors, or whatever the case may be. You know, so they're constantly presenting this as the most important thing in human life. And once the wall had come down, the first reward of the East Germans was to be made unemployed wholesale. There was no homelessness in East Germany, as indeed in other socialist countries. And when my book on the collapse of the Soviet Union came out, some German comrades translated it into German. So I went to most big German places to make presentations. They invited me to do that. And I saw places in East Germany where there were a lot of young people lounging around and sleeping rough on the street. And next to them were literally dozens and scores of properties lying empty. Just typical of capitalism. There's no shortage of accommodation. It's the function of a system to provide accommodation of food or employment. It's not the function of wealth. Otherwise, how would you find the richest country in the world, America, where a certain number of households, about 40 million people, are food scarce. There's not enough food for them. You can go to New York even today and you'd find poor people scrummaging through dustbins to find scraps of food to eat. Now, how do you do that? It's not some war-ravaged, poor third world country. It's the Mecca of capitalism. It's the free world's champion. And that's what happened. And that's what happened to the great Soviet Union. And for us, the lesson is that we have to literally start anew, bring to the working class what the tragedy that has happened and the setback that we have suffered, and explain to them the reasons for that. It's not the fault of Marxism-Leninism. It's not the fault of socialism. It's the distortion of socialism. And we must give good reasons. And even now, there are lots of parties in the world which actually do not put forward the correct view on why the Soviet Union collapsed. I meet some people in India, big parties, million-strong communist parties. So you discuss with them, why did the Soviet Union collapse? They say, well, because certain mistakes were made in the implementation of socialism. I said, thank you very much for the enlightenment that you've given me as a result of that. But they would not specifically do because they have their own past to worry about. They went along with Khrushchevite revisionism. They are, if you like, partners in that crime of bringing down socialism. But the best thing to do when you have made a mistake is to admit that you made a mistake. Then to find out the reasons why you made a mistake, and then to go on to correct them. And honesty in this matter, as in most others, is the best solution, that you know you made a mistake and you must really correct it. They did it under the influence of the Soviet Union, and the fault is theirs. Just because some party is powerful doesn't mean you have to obey them even when you know that they're saying something wrong. And if one thing has come from the collapse of the Soviet Union, even small parties have the chance, if they want to think with their own heads. But if you have locked up your brain and lost the key, there's no hope for you. There is very important reason for us to say that when the Soviet Union collapsed, it's not just a loss for the Soviet people. It's a loss for the people of the world. Everywhere, life had become better because of the Soviet Union. The working class in Western Europe gained considerably because the bourgeoisie was frightened of the red flag flying over their capitals. So they made concession to the working class. The Soviet Revolution gave a tremendous boost to the national liberation movement. It abolished the gap between the so-called civilized nations who were destined to rule themselves and the so-called barbarian nations who were never going to be capable of ruling themselves. It actually abolished all those myths, and its contributions are great. And on this birthday of Stalin, and discussing the reason for the demise of the Soviet Union, let us pay tribute to those who built such a wonderful society. Thank you for listening.